What if the person you treated like dirt held the power to change your entire future? It was a crisp morning in New York City, the sun casting its golden rays over the gleaming skyscrapers, and in the heart of it all stood Innovatech, a towering symbol of modern success. This tech giant had revolutionized the industry with cutting-edge innovations, attracting some of the brightest minds from across the globe. The company's headquarters was an impressive glass and steel structure, buzzing with energy as employees hurried to their respective departments, clutching coffee cups and laptops, ready to tackle the challenges of another demanding workday. At the center of this bustling enterprise was David Harkins, co-CEO of Innovatech. David embodied the quintessential corporate titan, sharp, polished, and undeniably successful. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his every move exuded confidence, but beneath the surface, his arrogance was almost palpable. David was known for getting what he wanted, and in his eyes, the people around him were merely tools to be used and discarded at his whim. His path to power had been littered with those who couldn't keep up or who dared to challenge him. As David strode through the sleek marble lobby of Innovatech, he glanced at his watch, annoyed by a meeting that had run late. His assistant struggled to keep up, reading out his schedule for the day, but David barely paid her any attention. To him, she was just another cog in the machine, a replaceable one at that. "You're late for the investor call, Mr. Harkins," she said, her voice tinged with nervousness. David waved her off dismissively. "They'll wait. They always do." He marched toward the elevators, barely noticing the people scurrying out of his way. Employees knew better than to cross his path or hold him up. David's reputation preceded him. Some whispered that he was ruthless, while others simply called him a tyrant. Either way, it didn't matter to David. In his mind, he was the reason Innovatech was on top, and without him, the company would crumble. As he approached the elevator, something caught his eye, a cleaner mopping the floor near the entrance. She moved quietly, deliberately, head down, and dressed in a standard janitorial uniform. David's lip curled in distaste as he glanced at her, barely registering her presence. To him, she was invisible, insignificant. Just another worker in the background who did her job and disappeared into the shadows when no longer needed. "Watch it," David snapped as he stepped around the woman, careful not to get any of the soapy water on his expensive leather shoes. The cleaner looked up, her dark brown eyes meeting his for just a moment before she averted her gaze. She offered no response, simply continuing with her task, her face a mask of quiet composure. David didn't give her another thought as he entered the elevator, ready to focus on the day ahead. What David couldn't have known, what no one could have guessed, was that the woman mopping the floor wasn't just a cleaner. Her name was Sophie Turner, and she was the true owner of Innovatech. In fact, she was the visionary who had built the company from the ground up. The very empire David took such pride in running was the result of her ideas, her leadership, and her hard work. But today, Sophie wasn't here as the CEO. She had taken on a different role, a role that allowed her to observe her company in a way few CEOs ever could. Sophie had decided to go undercover as a cleaner for one simple reason. She wanted to see how Innovatech was really being run, not from the boardroom, but from the ground up. For weeks, she had been hearing whispers of discontent, stories of toxic management, and complaints from employees who felt overlooked and mistreated. As someone who valued integrity and respect, Sophie had built Innovatech on the foundation of collaboration and innovation. But somewhere along the way, it seemed those values had been lost, especially by people like David Harkins. Sophie had met David years ago when the company was in its early stages. He had been ambitious, charming even, and his knowledge of the tech industry had made him a valuable asset. At the time, Sophie had believed in his potential. She had appointed him co-CEO, trusting that he would help lead Innovatech into the future. But over the years, David's ambition had turned into something darker. His hunger for power had grown insatiable, and with it, his arrogance. He had begun to treat Innovatech as if it were his personal kingdom, and the people working under him had become nothing more than pawns. Sophie had watched from a distance as complaints began to surface, first small grievances, but then larger ones. Employees spoke of David's harsh management style, his tendency to dismiss ideas that weren't his own, and the way he belittled those who dared to challenge him. But what had truly concerned Sophie were the reports of harassment and mistreatment. Several employees had anonymously complained about David's inappropriate behavior, particularly toward women, but nothing had ever come of it. David had a way of covering his tracks, and HR had been quick to sweep things under the rug. So Sophie had made a decision. She would step out of the spotlight, go undercover, and see for herself what was really happening in her company. And today was just another day in her ongoing mission to uncover the truth. As Sophie continued mopping the floor, she listened carefully to the conversations happening around her. Employees chatted in hushed tones about the latest product launch, about the never-ending pressure to meet deadlines, and, inevitably, about David Harkins. His name seemed to come up in every conversation, always accompanied by a sigh or a roll of the eyes. "He's impossible," one employee whispered to a colleague as they passed by Sophie. "I don't know how much longer I can take it. Every day it's like walking on eggshells." "Tell me about it," the other replied. "I heard he fired someone last week just because they didn't agree with him in a meeting." Sophie's grip tightened on the mop handle, her frustration growing. She had hoped that the rumors about David were exaggerated, but every day she spent undercover confirmed her worst fears. The company she had built with care and compassion had become a hostile environment, thanks in large part to David's toxic leadership. But this was only the beginning. Sophie knew she had to bide her time, gather more information, and ensure that when she finally revealed her true identity, there would be no room for David to talk his way out of the consequences. Sophie had always believed that leadership was about more than just making decisions from behind a desk. To understand a company, to truly know its strengths and weaknesses, a leader needed to walk among the people, hear their stories, see their struggles, and feel their frustrations. This belief had been the foundation of her decision to go undercover as a cleaner at Innovatech. But even she hadn't anticipated just how deep the rot had spread, nor how personally she would be affected by it. On the surface, Innovatech seemed like a beacon of success, shiny, polished, efficient. The floors gleamed with perfection, the walls were adorned with awards and accolades, and the tech innovations they produced were the envy of the industry. But beneath that veneer, Sophie was discovering a very different reality. Each morning she donned the janitor's uniform. It was as if she became invisible. No one paid her any attention beyond barking the occasional order or stepping around her, as though she were nothing more than a piece of the furniture. It was precisely what she had wanted. Anonymity gave her freedom to observe, and observe she did. Day after day, she wandered the halls of her own company, cleaning windows, emptying trash cans, and wiping down surfaces, while quietly taking in every conversation, every interaction, every whisper of discontent. Her decision to go undercover had been born from concern, but that concern was quickly morphing into something more akin to anger. David Harkins, her co-CEO, was at the center of it all. He had become a tyrant, a man whose ego had grown so large that he no longer saw the people working around him as human beings, but as tools for his personal success. And worse, the people who worked under him seemed terrified, either too afraid or too beaten down to challenge him. Sophie could still recall the moment when David had first harassed her. It had been just a few days into her undercover role, and she had been cleaning the windows in the conference room after a high-stakes meeting with investors. David had walked in, exuding his usual air of superiority, barely glancing at her as he flipped through some papers. "Make sure you get those spotless," he had said, his tone dripping with disdain. "We don't need smudges distracting anyone from the millions we're about to make." She had turned to face him, her hand still holding the window cleaner and cloth. David hadn't even looked up from his papers. He was too absorbed in his world of profits and power to acknowledge her presence beyond that single command. "Yes, sir," she had replied softly, playing her role as the dutiful cleaner. David had finally looked up then, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. There was a moment, a fleeting one, where Sophie wondered if he had recognized her. But no, his gaze lingered for only a second before his lips curled into a smug smile. "You should be grateful, you know," he had said, his voice taking on an oily tone. "Working here is probably the best thing that's ever happened to someone like you." Sophie's heart had pounded in her chest. Someone like you. She knew exactly what he meant. He saw her as beneath him, as just another worker whose only purpose was to serve. In that moment, she had wanted to drop the act, to reveal her true identity and put him in his place. But she had held back. The time wasn't right. Not yet. Over the following weeks, David's behavior toward her became more pointed, more personal. He would brush past her in the hallways, often too close, his hand grazing her arm or back in ways that felt far from accidental. Each time Sophie's stomach turned, but she knew she had to endure it for now. She needed to gather enough evidence to see the full extent of the damage he was causing before she could take action. She wouldn't just confront him in private. No, when the time came, David would face his reckoning in front of the entire board, with no way to escape. The other managers weren't much better. While none of them were quite as blatantly disrespectful as David, there was an air of superiority that clung to the upper management like a toxic cloud. They spoke down to the employees, dismissing ideas, shutting down creativity, and creating an environment where innovation, the very heart of innovative success, was being stifled. Sophie could feel the resentment simmering beneath the surface. Employees were doing the bare minimum to get by, too fearful of losing their jobs to speak out, but too disengaged to give their best efforts. It was a recipe for disaster. One day, while mopping the hallway outside David's office, Sophie overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst fears. David was inside speaking with one of his senior managers, a man named Frank who had been with the company for years. Frank had always struck Sophie as a quiet, diligent worker, but it was clear from the tone of his voice that he was growing increasingly frustrated. "I'm telling you, David, this is unsustainable," Frank was saying, his voice strained. "We can't keep pushing people like this. The turnover rate is skyrocketing, and if we keep losing talent, we're going to see it hit the bottom line." David's response was cold, dismissive. "You're overreacting. We've got people lining up to work here. If a few of them can't handle the pressure, then good riddance. We don't need dead weight." Frank sighed audibly. "It's not just about the pressure. The culture is toxic. People are afraid to speak up. They feel like they're walking on eggshells around you." There was a pause, and Sophie imagined David leaning back in his chair, smirking as he always did when he thought he was right. "Maybe they should be afraid," David finally said. "Fear keeps people in line. It keeps them focused." Frank sounded exasperated. "Fear isn't leadership, David. It's control, and it's going to backfire." Sophie's blood boiled as she listened. She had known for a while that things were bad, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms was infuriating. Fear, control. These were not the principles on which she had built Innovatech. She had always believed in empowerment, in giving people the freedom to innovate, to take risks, to feel like they were part of something bigger. But under David's regime, fear had become the currency of management, and it was destroying everything she had worked for. As the days went on, Sophie's undercover mission became more difficult. David's harassment grew bolder. He would accidentally bump into her, his hand lingering too long on her shoulder, or he'd make lewd comments about her appearance, all while keeping up the pretense of being the untouchable co-CEO. Each time, Sophie had to swallow her anger, knowing that soon enough, his time would come. One afternoon, Sophie found herself cleaning near the break room, where a group of employees were gathered. They spoke in hushed tones, but she could still make out snippets of their conversation. "I can't believe the way he talks to people," one woman said, shaking her head. "Last week, he told me I should be grateful I even have a job here. Like I don't work my butt off every day." "Tell me about it," another man chimed in. "I saw him reduce one of the interns to tears yesterday. Just shredded her in front of the whole team for making a minor mistake." Sophie's heart sank. The stories were becoming all too familiar. David's arrogance was poisoning the very culture that had once made Innovatech a place of creativity and collaboration. It was clear that something needed to be done, and soon. That evening, after everyone had left the office, Sophie sat alone in the janitor's closet, her thoughts racing. She had seen enough: the harassment, the toxic leadership, the fear that gripped her employees. David's time was up, but this wasn't just about firing him. It was about making sure Innovatech could recover, that it could return to being the company she had always envisioned. Sophie knew that when she revealed her true identity, it would shock everyone. But more than that, It would be a reckoning for David and for anyone who had contributed to the toxic culture he had fostered. Tomorrow, she would take the first steps toward reclaiming her company. David Harkins had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated her, treated her like she was invisible. But soon he would realize that the woman he had harassed, dismissed, and belittled held the power to change everything. Sophie felt the weight of her decision every morning as she stepped into her cleaning uniform, pulling her hair back into a simple ponytail and slipping on the name tag that read Sophie in plain, unassuming letters. She had become part of the background, a figure few acknowledged, blending seamlessly into the hum of Innovatech's day-to-day operations. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of what her company had become hit her harder with each passing moment. It wasn't just David. He was a symptom of a larger problem, the figurehead of a toxic culture that had taken root in her absence. The management team, many of whom had once been young and eager recruits, seemed to have adopted his attitude, letting arrogance and cruelty replace the sense of collaboration and integrity Sophie had worked so hard to build. One of the managers, Claire Richardson, was someone Sophie had once mentored personally. Claire had started as a bright-eyed intern with an infectious enthusiasm for technology and problem-solving. Sophie remembered the long hours they'd spent together discussing new ideas, with Claire bringing boundless energy and fresh perspectives to every challenge they faced. Sophie had been so proud of Claire's rise through the ranks. But now, as Sophie watched from the shadows, she saw a very different woman. Claire, now a department head, had grown colder, more distant. She managed through intimidation, barking orders at her team and cutting them off in meetings. Sophie had overheard her belittling a junior developer just the other day for presenting an idea that wasn't perfectly polished. "This is amateur work," Claire had snapped, glaring at the young man, who had clearly spent hours preparing his presentation. "I don't know why I'm even wasting my time looking at this." The developer had stammered an apology, his face turning red as he quickly gathered his things and left the room, shoulders hunched. Sophie had watched from the corner, her heart sinking. This wasn't the Claire she knew. This wasn't the kind of leadership she had envisioned for Innovatech. Sophie's frustration grew each time she witnessed another incident like that one. It wasn't just about David's behavior anymore. It was the ripple effect he had created throughout the company. His arrogance and cruelty had emboldened others to follow suit, as though treating people with disrespect was a mark of success, a way to assert dominance in the corporate hierarchy. And the worst part was that many of these managers had started out as decent, hardworking people. Somewhere along the way, under David's influence, they had lost their way. One evening, after the office had mostly cleared out, Sophie found herself cleaning the conference room again. It was the same room where David had first spoken down to her, and the memory still lingered in her mind. As she wiped down the table, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices coming from the hallway. Sophie quietly moved closer to the door, listening as two senior executives, both close allies of David, had a hushed conversation. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," one of them said, his voice low and tense. "The board's starting to ask questions about the turnover rate, and HR's getting overwhelmed with complaints." The other executive sighed. "We just need to hold out until the next quarter's numbers come in. If we can show strong financials, they'll forget about the rest. Besides, David has a way of smoothing things over. He's already got half the board eating out of his hand." Sophie's jaw clenched as she listened. So it wasn't just the employees who were suffering. The upper management knew exactly what was going on. They were complicit in the toxic culture, too focused on protecting their positions and maintaining their grip on power to care about the damage they were doing. That night, as Sophie left the office and walked the streets of New York, her mind raced. She had seen enough. The company was sick, and the infection had spread far beyond David Harkins. The entire leadership structure needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. And Sophie knew that when the time came, she couldn't just remove David. She would need to take a hard look at every person in a position of power and make the difficult decisions about who would stay and who would go. The next morning, Sophie's frustration reached new heights as she overheard yet another conversation, this time between two middle managers discussing a female employee who had recently resigned. One of the managers, a man named Tim, was chuckling as he recounted the situation. "Yeah, she said she couldn't handle the pressure anymore," Tim said, making air quotes with his fingers. But let's be honest, she just couldn't hack it. Some people aren't cut out for this industry. The other manager, a woman who had been silent up to that point, finally spoke up. I heard she went to HR about David before she left. Tim scoffed. HR? What's HR going to do? David runs this place. If you're not on his good side, you might as well pack your bags. Sophie had heard enough. The employees were terrified to speak out, knowing that HR, the very department meant to protect them, was powerless, or worse, complicit, in covering for David and his allies. The realization was painful, but it gave Sophie the final piece of the puzzle. David had built a culture of fear, one where employees were too afraid to challenge the status quo, too afraid to push back against injustice, and that was the antithesis of everything Sophie stood for. As Sophie continued her undercover mission, she began to notice the smaller things that added to the weight of the toxicity. Little gestures, glances, and whispers that all contributed to the pervasive sense of unease within the company. She saw how people tensed up when David entered a room, how conversations would abruptly stop when a manager walked by, and how no one seemed to feel safe speaking their mind. She also started noticing the exhaustion on people's faces, the deep, weary lines under their eyes, the slumped shoulders, the way they barely made eye contact with one another. Innovatech had once been a place where people thrived, where they felt empowered to bring their best ideas to the table. Now it was a place where people merely survived, doing the minimum required to keep their jobs, trying not to get noticed by the wrong people. But it wasn't just the managers and the executives who had bought into this culture. Sophie had witnessed lower-level employees bullying each other, as though they believed that mimicking the behavior of those above them would somehow earn them respect or a promotion. It was a culture of survival, where people believed that stepping on others was the only way to get ahead. And it broke Sophie's heart. One afternoon, Sophie overheard a group of interns whispering in the break room, talking about their experiences during their short time at Innovatech. I thought this place would be different, one of them said, shaking her head, but it's just as cutthroat as everywhere else, maybe worse. Another intern, a young man who looked no older than 20, nodded in agreement. I've been told 3 times this week that if I don't work late, I'll be replaced. I thought we were supposed to be learning here, not competing to see who can survive the longest. The third intern sighed. I just don't understand why no one does anything about it. People complain, but nothing changes. Sophie's chest tightened. These interns were the future of the company, the ones who should have been mentored, encouraged, and taught the values that had once defined Innovatech. But instead, they were being indoctrinated into a toxic system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Sophie was mopping the floor near the entrance when David stormed past her, clearly in a foul mood. He was muttering under his breath, something about incompetent employees and how he was sick of carrying the weight of this company. Sophie kept her head down, trying to stay out of his way, but just as she was about to step aside, David turned to her, his eyes narrowing. You missed a spot, he said, pointing to the floor near the doorway. His tone was biting, sharp. Sophie froze for a moment, feeling the familiar surge of anger rise in her chest, but she said nothing, forcing herself to stay calm. She had endured weeks of his condescension, his veiled threats, his dismissive attitude. She could handle one more comment. She could handle this. But then David took a step closer. Honestly, he said, his voice lowering as he leaned in, I don't know why we keep people like you around. You're replaceable. Do you even understand how lucky you are to be here, in a place like this? That was it. Sophie's grip on the mop tightened as she felt the anger, the frustration, and the deep sense of betrayal she had carried for weeks flood through her. She wanted to tell him right then and there. She wanted to throw down the mop, reveal her true identity, and watch the color drain from his smug face. But she didn't. Instead, she met his gaze, her voice steady and calm, though her hands shook with restrained fury. I understand a lot more than you think. David stared at her for a moment, clearly caught off guard by her response. But before he could say anything else, one of his assistants appeared, pulling him away for a meeting. He threw one last look of contempt in her direction before disappearing down the hall, leaving Sophie standing there, the mop still in her hands, her heart pounding. She had reached her limit. David had no idea who he was talking to, but soon he would. Soon everyone would. Sophie wasn't going to wait much longer. The time for gathering information was over. It was time for action. The day had finally arrived. Sophie woke up with a sense of resolve that had been building for weeks, a determination that coursed through her like an electric current. She had spent enough time watching, waiting, and biting her tongue. She had witnessed the damage David Harkins and his ilk had wrought on her company, seen firsthand how the people she had once trusted had twisted Innovatech's culture into something almost unrecognizable. Today it all came to a head. She had carefully chosen the timing for the reveal. It would happen during the quarterly board meeting, the most high-profile event at Innovatech, where the entire executive team, including David, would be present. The company's financials were strong, and the numbers would be in their favor. But Sophie wasn't interested in the profits that had been earned at the cost of people's dignity. She was focused on something far more important, the future of Innovatech and the reckoning that was about to unfold. Sophie arrived at the office early that morning, but instead of heading to the janitorial closet to put on her cleaning uniform, she went to a private room she had reserved on the top floor. There, waiting for her, was a sharp black suit, tailored perfectly to fit her, a symbol of the authority she had silently held all along. It felt like slipping back into her true self as she buttoned the crisp jacket and straightened her collar. No more invisibility, no more hiding in plain sight. Today she would take her rightful place as the leader of the company she had built from scratch. She spent a few moments looking at herself in the mirror. Gone was the quiet cleaner who had blended into the background. In her place stood Sophie Turner, CEO and founder of Innovatech, a woman who had created a global powerhouse with her vision and tenacity. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't just the clothes. It was the mindset, the fire in her eyes, the knowledge that today would mark the end of David Harkins' reign of terror. Outside the boardroom, employees were bustling about, preparing for the meeting, oblivious to the bombshell that was about to be dropped. Sophie walked through the hallways with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors, heads turning as people suddenly noticed her presence. Some of them did double takes, their expressions confused, as if trying to place her. They had seen her before, but never like this. Dressed in her cleaner's uniform, she had been invisible. But now in her tailored suit, she was impossible to ignore. David was already in the boardroom when she arrived, laughing loudly with a few of his cronies, his usual air of superiority filling the room. He hadn't noticed her yet. His back was turned, and he was too engrossed in his own bravado, talking about the latest deals he'd closed and how Innovatech's future was brighter than ever. Thanks, of course, to his leadership. Sophie stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. She could see the smirks on the faces of some of the other executives, the way they basked in the glow of David's arrogance, as if his success was their own. But that was all about to change. As she stepped into the room, a hush began to fall over the crowd. Conversations died mid-sentence, and heads turned toward her. David, still facing away, continued speaking, oblivious to the sudden shift in the room's energy. And really, if we just cut some of the dead weight in the lower levels, we could easily boost productivity by another. He trailed off as one of the executives seated at the table nudged him, nodding in Sophie's direction. David turned around, his trademark smirk still plastered on his face, until his eyes landed on Sophie. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her. His brows furrowed in confusion, his eyes scanning her from head to toe as if trying to make sense of who this woman was and why she was walking into the boardroom as if she owned the place. Then slowly, recognition flickered in his eyes. It was subtle at first, a flicker of disbelief, followed by a dawning realization. "You," he started, his voice uncertain for the first time in as long as Sophie had known him. "What are you doing here?" The room was dead silent now, all eyes on Sophie. She allowed the tension to build for just a moment, watching as David's arrogance began to falter, confusion and unease creeping into his expression. She wanted this moment to settle, to let the weight of it sink into the room before she spoke. "I'm here for the board meeting," Sophie said calmly, her voice clear and steady, After all, as the owner of Innovatech, I think it's about time I joined the conversation. The shock on David's face was palpable. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing, as if trying to form words. But nothing coherent came out. The other executives exchanged nervous glances, their own confusion quickly turning to fear as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Sophie didn't wait for David to recover. She stepped forward, moving to the head of the table, the seat that rightfully belonged to her. As she did, the other board members made space for her, their eyes wide with uncertainty. Once she was seated, she placed her hands on the table and looked around the room, taking in each face, including David's, before continuing. For weeks now, I've been observing, she said, watching how this company is run, watching how people are treated. And what I've seen is not the Innovatech I built, not the company I envisioned. Innovatech was founded on innovation, collaboration, and respect. But somewhere along the way, those values have been lost. David finally found his voice, though it was shaky. Sophie, this is insane. You've been you've been posing as a cleaner? That's ridiculous. Why would you even do that? Sophie met his gaze, her eyes cold and unyielding. Because I wanted to see how you and the rest of the management were running things when you thought no one important was watching. I wanted to see the truth. David's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to argue, but Sophie raised her hand, silencing him. And the truth, she continued, is worse than I could have imagined. I've seen employees harassed, disrespected, and dismissed. I've seen a culture of fear take hold, where people are too afraid to speak up, to contribute, to innovate. That is not what Innovatic is about. That is not what I'm about. The room was deathly silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. David's smugness had evaporated entirely, replaced by a growing sense of panic. He glanced around at the other board members, silently pleading for support, but none of them came to his aid. They were all too shocked, too unsure of what was about to happen. Sophie's gaze hardened as she turned her attention back to David. And you, David, you are the source of much of this toxicity. I've seen how you treat employees, how you belittle them, harass them, and drive them away. You've fostered a culture where only your voice matters, where only your ideas are valued. That ends today. David's face contorted with indignation. You can't be serious. I've been running this company, your company, for years. I've made it what it is today. Without me, this place would have fallen apart. Sophie's calm demeanor never wavered. Without you, Innovatech will finally have a chance to thrive in the way it was always meant to. A company's success is not measured by profits alone, David. It's measured by the well-being of its people, by the environment in which they work. And under your leadership, Innovatech has become a place of fear, not innovation. She looked toward the door, and as if on cue, it opened. Her brother, Michael Turner, walked in, a stack of legal documents in his hand. He approached the table with purpose, setting the documents down in front of David. David Harkins, Michael said, his voice firm, you're fired, effective immediately. Your conduct has not only been unethical, but has violated multiple company policies. We've gathered enough evidence to pursue legal action if necessary. David's face went pale. This is a joke, right? You can't just... But Sophie cut him off again, her voice steely. This is not a joke, David. You've had free rein for far too long. You've misused your power, and now you will face the consequences. The board will be notified of your termination, and the legal team will handle the rest. You are no longer welcome at Innovatech. For a moment, David sat frozen, his eyes darting around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But no one spoke. The silence was deafening. Finally, with no other options, David rose from his seat, his face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. He turned to Sophie one last time, his voice a low growl. You'll regret this. You need me. This company needs me. Sophie stood, meeting his gaze head on. No, David, we don't. And with that, David stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as the door slammed shut behind him. The remaining executives sat in stunned silence, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Sophie looked around the room, her expression softening slightly. She knew that not everyone here was complicit in David's actions. There were still good people at Innovatech, people who cared about the company's future and the well-being of its employees. And those people would stay. As for the rest of you, Sophie said, her voice calm but firm, there will be changes. Anyone who has contributed to the toxic culture that has taken root here will be held accountable. Those of you who have acted with integrity, who have remained true to Innovatech's values, will have nothing to fear. But make no mistake, this company is going to change, and it's going to start today. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. They all knew that Sophie meant every word. Michael gathered the remaining documents, his presence beside Sophie a reassuring one. Together, they were ready to rebuild Innovatech from the ashes of what David had nearly destroyed. As Sophie looked around the room one last time, she felt a sense of closure, but also of renewal. This was the beginning of a new chapter for Innovatech, one built on the values she had always believed in. And as she left the boardroom that day, Sophie knew that Innovatech's future was brighter than it had ever been. The dust had barely settled from David Harkin's departure, but the impact of his sudden firing rippled through Innovatech like a shockwave. Word spread quickly. Employees whispered in break rooms, shared furtive glances in the hallways, and sent messages back and forth, all filled with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The company's co-CEO was gone, but the full story, the truth about Sophie's undercover mission, was only beginning to surface. Sophie, now firmly back in her role as CEO, stood at the center of it all. The moment after David's exit had been surreal, watching the stunned faces of the remaining executives, their guarded silence, their uncertainty about what would come next. Sophie knew that David's firing wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger transformation that Innovatech desperately needed. As Sophie walked through the halls later that day, the reactions were palpable. Some people met her gaze with uncertainty, unsure of who she was now. Was she still that quiet woman they had seen mopping floors? Or was she the CEO they now understood had been watching them? All of them, from a unique vantage point. Others, however, looked at her with newfound respect, their eyes reflecting the weight of what they had learned. Sophie Turner, the very woman who had built Innovatech, had been among them all along, observing silently, gathering knowledge, and preparing to make drastic changes. She had made a promise to herself. David wasn't the only one who would be held accountable. There were others, those in management who had allowed the toxic culture to flourish unchecked. And while Sophie had no desire to create an atmosphere of fear, she knew that decisive action was required to send a clear message. Innovatech was no longer a place where abuse of power would be tolerated. Her first order of business was a series of meetings with HR, legal, and the heads of various departments. It wasn't just about cleaning house. It was about building something better, something that aligned with the company's original values. Sitting in the boardroom once again, this time with her brother Michael by her side, Sophie began outlining the steps that would be taken. Effective immediately, we're conducting a full audit of every department, Sophie said, her voice calm but firm. We're reviewing complaints, employee feedback, and performance reviews. Anyone who has perpetuated the toxic culture that David enabled will face consequences. But this isn't just about removing people. It's about giving those who have been silenced a voice again. Her team nodded, though some of the department heads shifted uneasily in their seats. Sophie noticed the tension, the unspoken fear among those who knew they had turned a blind eye to David's behavior, or worse, had participated in it. But there were others, people like Frank, the senior manager who had tried to speak up in that meeting Sophie had overheard. She would make sure those people knew that their efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. They were the key to rebuilding Innovatech. The days that followed were intense. Sophie and her brother worked around the clock, interviewing employees, reviewing complaints, and combing through mountains of documents. The investigation was painstaking, but it was necessary. As the process unfolded, more and more stories came to light, stories of harassment, mistreatment, and employees who had been pushed to their breaking point under David's rule. Some had left the company entirely, unable to withstand the pressure, while others had stayed, enduring the daily humiliation because they had no other choice. One evening, as Sophie sat in her office surrounded by stacks of papers, she paused for a moment, staring out at the New York skyline. The weight of everything she had learned pressed heavily on her. Innovatech had become something she no longer recognized. How had it come to this? How had David's influence grown so unchecked? But even as the questions swirled in her mind, Sophie knew that focusing on the past wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was the future. Michael entered the office carrying a file of reports. "You look exhausted," he said, setting the file down on her desk. "We've made progress, but it's going to be a long road." "I know," Sophie replied, rubbing her temples, "but it's a road we need to take." Michael sat down across from her, his eyes serious. "I've been talking to some of the employees we've interviewed. They're hopeful, Sophie. A lot of them have been waiting for this change, for you to take back control. They believe in you." Sophie nodded, grateful for his support. "It's not just about me, though. It's about making sure this never happens again. We need to put structures in place that empower people, that hold leadership accountable, no matter who's at the top." Michael smiled. "And we will. But you need to give yourself credit. You're the one who had the courage to go undercover, to see the truth for yourself." Sophie looked at her brother, appreciating his unwavering confidence in her. She had been driven by necessity, by a sense of responsibility to the people who had built Innovatech with her. They deserved better, and she would make sure they got it. The audit continued over the next few weeks, and, as Sophie had predicted, more heads rolled. Several senior managers, including Claire Richardson, were let go after it became clear they had fostered a toxic environment in their departments. Sophie had been saddened by Claire's fall. She had once believed in her potential, but there was no room for leniency when it came to restoring Innovatech's integrity. Claire's actions, while perhaps shaped by David's influence, were her own. Sophie personally met with the employees who had been most affected by David's reign. She listened to their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for the future. Many were still wary, unsure if the changes would truly last, but Sophie reassured them that she was committed to rebuilding the company from the ground up. She made it clear that Innovatech's leadership would no longer be a monolithic, untouchable entity. Instead, it would be a place where transparency, respect, and accountability were at the core of everything they did. But it wasn't just about removing the bad apples. Sophie knew that for Innovatech to truly thrive, they needed to rebuild the culture, one where creativity and collaboration could flourish again. She organized town hall meetings with employees from all levels, inviting them to share their ideas for improving the company. These meetings, which Sophie attended personally, were eye-opening. People who had once felt silenced or undervalued were now speaking up, offering innovative ideas that had been buried for too long under the weight of David's oppressive leadership. As the weeks went on, Innovatech began to transform. Sophie implemented new policies focused on employee well-being, mental health programs, flexible working hours, and mentorship initiatives designed to help people grow in their careers without the fear of being belittled or dismissed. HR was overhauled, with a new team brought in to ensure that complaints were taken seriously and handled with transparency and fairness. Sophie wanted every employee to know that Innovatech was once again a place where they could thrive, not just survive. The most important change, however, was the shift in leadership. Sophie had always believed in a collaborative model, one where different voices could be heard and valued. She restructured the executive team, bringing in new leaders who shared her vision of a healthy, innovative workplace. These new leaders were not just experts in their fields, but people who valued empathy, communication, and integrity, traits that Sophie now knew were just as important as technical skill. One of the biggest challenges came from repairing the trust that had been broken. Sophie knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, especially after everything that had happened. It would take time, consistency, and a genuine commitment to change. But she was willing to put in the work, and so were the employees who had stayed through the worst of it. They wanted to believe in Innovatech again, and Sophie would do everything in her power to make sure they could. The turning point came several months later, during a company-wide meeting. Sophie stood on the stage addressing the entire Innovatech team, hundreds of employees, all looking to her for guidance, for leadership. The energy in the room was different now. There was a sense of cautious optimism, a feeling that perhaps, After everything that had happened, the company was finally moving in the right direction. Sophie took a deep breath before she spoke, knowing that this moment would set the tone for Innovatech's future. When I founded Innovatech, she began, her voice steady and clear, I had a vision. I wanted to create a company that wasn't just successful financially, but one that valued innovation, collaboration, and respect. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that vision. And for that, I take full responsibility. The room was silent, every eye on her. But today we start fresh. Today we reclaim the values that made Innovatech great in the first place. This isn't just about me or the leadership team. It's about all of us. Innovatech is a place where every person's voice matters, where every idea has the potential to shape our future. Together we can build something better, something we can all be proud of. There was a moment of stillness after Sophie's words, and then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. It started small, a few claps here and there, but soon it grew, filling the space with a palpable sense of hope and unity. Sophie stood there, feeling the weight of the applause, knowing that this was the beginning of a new chapter for Innovatic. The road ahead would be long, but they were on the right path. Under her leadership, Innovatech would once again become a company where innovation thrived, where people were treated with respect, and where every person, from the newest intern to the most senior executive, could feel proud to be a part of something truly special. And as Sophie looked out at the sea of faces before her, she knew that the hardest part was behind them. Innovatech had been through the fire, and now it was time to rebuild, to rise stronger, better, and more united than ever before. Months had passed since the upheaval at Innovatech, and the company was beginning to feel like the place Sophie had always envisioned. It wasn't easy. Transforming a culture that had rotted from within took more than a few meetings, policy changes, or even new leadership. It took time, patience, and commitment from everyone involved. But slowly, steadily, the change was happening. Walking through the offices now, Sophie could see the difference. Gone was the pervasive tension that had once filled the air, replaced by a buzz of energy and excitement. Employees no longer darted anxious glances around, fearing a sudden outburst from a superior or wondering if today would be the day their job was on the line. Now people smiled as they passed each other in the hallways, exchanged ideas freely, and met in the common areas to collaborate. The walls of fear that had once separated the executives from the rest of the staff had come down, brick by brick. Sophie often found herself lingering in these common areas, watching the informal discussions that sprouted up between employees from different departments. It was something she had always encouraged, a free exchange of ideas, unhampered by hierarchy. In the early days of Innovatech, it had been common for an intern to strike up a conversation with a senior engineer, or for a junior developer to pitch an idea to Sophie herself. That openness had led to some of the company's most groundbreaking innovations. Now she could see that spirit returning, and it filled her with a deep sense of pride. Her presence in the company was also different now. No longer the silent observer in the shadows, Sophie had re-established herself as the leader of Innovatech, but in a way that felt far more personal than it had before. She was no longer seen as an aloof figure sitting behind a desk on the top floor. She made herself accessible, walking through the office, chatting with employees, and listening to their ideas and concerns firsthand. It was important to her that people knew she wasn't just their CEO. She was someone who cared about them, their work, and the company they were building together. One afternoon, Sophie found herself sitting in the cafeteria, something she hadn't done in years. It had once been her favorite place to take a break, to mingle with employees and catch up on the little details of their lives. But during the reign of David and his toxic culture, it had become a place she avoided, not wanting to see the strain on people's faces or overhear the whispers of dissatisfaction. Now, though, the atmosphere was different. People laughed, shared stories, and seemed genuinely happy to be there. As Sophie sipped her coffee, a young woman approached her, nervously clutching a tablet. She looked like she couldn't have been more than a few months into her job, fresh-faced and eager, with wide, excited eyes. "Excuse me, Miss Turner," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't mean to bother you, but I've been working on a project that I think could really help streamline our internal communication system. I was wondering if you had a few minutes to take a look." Sophie smiled warmly. This was exactly the kind of interaction she had wanted to encourage. Of course, she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. I'd love to hear about it. The woman sat down, her nervousness giving way to excitement as she opened her tablet and began showing Sophie her prototype. As she explained the features and walked Sophie through her ideas, it became clear that she had put a great deal of thought into the project. Sophie listened intently, asking questions and offering feedback, but mostly she just let the woman talk, eager to foster the kind of environment where even the newest employees felt empowered to share their ideas. When the presentation was over, Sophie nodded, impressed. This is fantastic, she said. I think you're onto something really valuable here. Why don't you set up a meeting with the development team and show them what you've got? I'll make sure they take a serious look at this. The young woman's eyes lit up, a mix of relief and joy washing over her. Thank you so much. I wasn't sure if anyone would be interested, but I really believe this could help. Sophie smiled again. You believed in your idea, and that's what matters. Don't ever be afraid to share it. That's how Innovatech will grow, through people like you who aren't afraid to push the envelope. As the woman left, clearly energized, Sophie felt a renewed sense of purpose. These moments, these small but meaningful interactions, were what Innovac had been missing for so long. The culture of fear had silenced too many voices, and Sophie was determined never to let that happen again. But there was still work to be done. The changes they had made were significant, but culture wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It was a living, breathing thing that needed constant care and attention. And while the major players like David and his toxic allies were gone, the scars they had left on the company would take time to heal. Sophie knew that some employees were still cautious, still hesitant to fully embrace the new direction. Trust once broken was hard to rebuild. That's why Sophie made transparency a cornerstone of Innovatech's new leadership model. She held regular all-hands meetings where employees could ask questions directly to the leadership team, and she encouraged managers to hold open office hours where anyone could stop by and discuss concerns. No issue was too small to address, and no person was too insignificant to be heard. Sophie wanted everyone to know that Innovatech wasn't just her company, it belonged to everyone who worked there. One of the most challenging aspects of the transition was working with the remaining executives and managers who had survived the initial purge. Not all of them had been complicit in David's toxic behavior, but some had been passive, turning a blind eye to the problems because it was easier than confronting them. Sophie had to make it clear that those days were over. She held a series of meetings with these leaders, setting new expectations and outlining the company's vision moving forward. During one of these meetings, Sophie addressed the group with the same calm authority she had shown during the boardroom confrontation with David. I understand that change is difficult, she began, looking around the room at the faces of people who had weathered the storm with her. But we're not just changing the way we do business. We're changing the way we lead. Leadership isn't about control or power. It's about empowering others, about creating an environment where people can do their best work without fear. If you're not willing to embrace that, then Innovatech may no longer be the place for you. There was a moment of silence as the weight of her words settled over the room. Some of the managers nodded in agreement, clearly on board with the new direction. Others looked uneasy, knowing that the expectations had been raised and that the old way of doing things was no longer acceptable. Sophie continued, her tone firm but not unkind. I'm here to support you, to help you grow as leaders in this new environment. But make no mistake, if we see any behavior that undermines the culture we're trying to build, there will be consequences. We can't afford to go back to the way things were. It was a difficult conversation, but it was necessary. Sophie knew that leadership, more than anything, would set the tone for Innovatech's future. If the managers and executives weren't on board with the changes, the company's transformation would stall. But if they were willing to grow and adapt, Innovatech could become something truly extraordinary. In the weeks that followed, Sophie saw real progress. Managers who had once ruled through intimidation were now making efforts to connect with their teams, seeking feedback, and collaborating more openly. The employees, too, were responding to the changes. The fear that had once defined the workplace was slowly being replaced by a renewed sense of optimism and excitement. Sophie's inbox began to fill with messages from employees at all levels, thanking her for the changes, sharing their ideas, or simply expressing relief that Innovatech was no longer the toxic place it had been. One message in particular stood out to her. It came from a longtime employee, someone who had been with the company since the early days but had become disillusioned during David's reign. "I've been here for 10 years," the message read, "and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can actually breathe again. I'm excited to come to work. I'm proud to be part of Innovatech. Thank you for giving us that back." Sophie sat back in her chair after reading the message, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why she had fought so hard, why she had gone undercover, why she had endured weeks of harassment and frustration. It wasn't just about firing David or removing the toxic leadership. It was about restoring something that had been lost. Innovatech was a place where people could thrive again, where they could feel valued and respected. But Sophie wasn't complacent. She knew there was still a long way to go. The company had made great strides, but the journey was far from over. She had to remain vigilant, ensuring that the new culture they were building stayed strong and that no one slipped back into the old ways of doing things. As Innovatech moved forward, Sophie felt more connected to her company than ever before. The experience of going undercover had changed her in profound ways. She had always believed in leading from the front, but now she understood just how important it was to also lead from within, to be among the people, to see the company through their eyes. She had learned that leadership wasn't just about making decisions from the top. It was about listening, about being present, about empowering others to lead in their own right. And that, more than anything, was the legacy she wanted to leave at Innovatech. Sophie stood by the large windows of her office one evening, watching the city below as the lights of New York flickered to life. The skyline stretched out before her, a reminder of the vast possibilities that lay ahead. Innovatech was more than just a company to her. It was a symbol of what could happen when people came together, when they shared ideas, when they treated each other with respect. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of the past lifting as she looked toward the future. The company had been through its darkest days, but it had emerged stronger, more united, and more resilient. And under her leadership, Innovatech's best days were still ahead.